Today, I'm going to start with just a brief overview of some terms from the Talmud, and then we're going to go straight into some text study. Okay, so Tana means a repeater, and it's a repeater of traditions. The Tannaitic sources lived in 70 to 220 CE. That means Common Era. You might be more familiar with it being called AD. They worked in disciple circles, so they didn't have actual formal academies. They were small groups of people. The really interesting way to understand both the Talmud and the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism is that these people were philosophers. They were Jewish philosophical circles in the same way that Plato and Socrates had circles of students around them that carried on the tradition of their teachings. And that is actually the model that they took from in order to create their lineage. So the Mishnah is said to have been compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and it was very discreet. It was things that had been remembered and completely memorized. So they were enigmatic in a way. You had to really know the context of the way that it was explained by your teacher in order to understand these writings. And they, for a long time, they wouldn't write it down. They obviously knew how to write, but they were building up the case that this source material was the continuation, the exact continuation of all of the speaking from God that came down to Moses, and that this was the true way forward for Judaism. So part of how to do that was to keep it oral and to not have a written text that people could dispute. And then once their circles of knowledge became concrete enough in the Jewish community, then someone decided that it was okay to put it down into a book form. So that happened around 200 to 225 CE. A Baraita will often be mentioned in the Talmud, and that is a story that was first composed or purported. People say it was composed at the time of the Mishnah, and it was not included in that text. But it is considered, because the rabbinic tradition considers earlier sources to be more stronger in their disputes than later sources, it is held on a higher ground than just the conversation of people that lived after the Tannaitic period. So the whole thing about the Talmud is that it's not meant to be for passive reception. You're not supposed to reify it. It is not the Bible. It is supposed to be a catalyst for creating an ideal rabbinic society. And the other thing to note is that the synagogue was a communal institution led by local elites. Synagogues as we know it now is not how it started. And it took time for the rabbis to gain a level of authority in the community in order to be welcomed in and taken in as the future leaders of a synagogue. At first, if you had money, you had power in a Jewish community. And this was as true about local merchant elites as it was of the priests. The priests that lineage was passed down male to male in the same line of a family. So you didn't have to even be able to read in order to be called a Kohen. You had to be born to a Kohen. And that was part of the problem that Jews were grappling with in the Second Temple period, that they didn't like the way that there were two different priestly families that were competing to be the high priest and were sending bribes to the authorities in order to be placed as the high priest. That kind of warring was clearly not for any spiritual reason. It was a purely political matter. So there was lessening and lessening of the power of the priestly class, which left this power vacuum for the sages to come into. This is also not how a Orthodox rabbi would tell you that Rabbinic Judaism came about. So part of my passion is combining what historians understand about the periods with our religious tradition, and that we don't have to be so pious about the ways that the rabbis spoke about themselves to discount the reality of what was happening at the time. So Amora is the name for a single person. Amoraim is the multiple people that were explainers, and most of them lived in Babylon. Most Jews follow the Babylonian Talmud. It is the more complete, not complete, it is just a longer Talmud than the Jerusalem Talmud, which was not actually written in Jerusalem. It was written in the land of Israel. It's known as the Jerusalem Talmud, but it was completed before the Babylonian Talmud, and it contains some of the same material, but not all. But the Babylonian Talmud has a more robust tradition behind it, more robust people explaining it. So Amoraim are the ones who put forth their dialogues, and they lived over the course of 200 to 500 CE. Now, we have rabbis have understood that there were stam, which means anonymous. There were these anonymous people who weaved together all of the conversations that were passed on from one philosophical community to another. In this period in Babylon, which is really Persia, is when the Talmud as we know it was put together. Yes, Jan.
Okay, so a Sofer Stam is a guy that writes Torahs, and so he's an anonymous writer of the Torah?
Right, because he doesn't write his name anywhere on it, that he's the one that wrote it.
Thank you.
So, and then the other important thing to know is that in the Talmud, it will say that one person talks to another person. They could be talking across centuries. It is an oral tradition, and it is meant to come into contact with one another, that two traditions are communicating with one another. It is not necessarily a clear historical artifact of an actual conversation that happened. There are actual conversations that happen, but it is it's much more useful, in my opinion, to see it as literature. And that is how academics study the Talmud now. They look at it as the literary history of the people that wrote it, and they look at the genres that are included in it. They parse out from wording when they think that things were written, and it's a beautiful deconstruction that doesn't fully tell you how the Jewish tradition has used the Talmud, but it tells you more about the people who created it. So the first level of the Talmud is the Mishnah, which was the first to be compiled. There is a disagreements about when the Gemara, which is the second level that includes those Amoraim's discussions, was compiled sometime between, and most scholars these days think it was a process, that it's a very large collection of books. So it is much more likely that they became written down over the course of hundreds of years. And so that's why you see that framework. Now, there are many rabbis will just tell you that the Babylonian Talmud was compiled in the 500 CE and stopped there. But the way that scholars see it, it probably continued on for a while. Now, the other sad thing about this is that our continuation of our religion, our our expansion of what it was to be Jewish through the Talmud was not liked by many authority figures. And so there was a lot of burning of the Talmud. And there was an assumption that if you burned our Talmuds, we would stop being a living people. So we don't actually have any source material of the Talmud from before a certain point in the Middle Ages, which is just pretty devastating if you're interested in seeing the progression of written text, if you're interested in seeing the progression of us as a people. But it is beautiful that we had enough members of our community who were willing and able to memorize it to be able to continue to pass it on. So before we go into some text study, does anyone have any questions about the Talmud or the origins of Rabbinic Judaism? Pretty broad topic, but happy to take a stab at it. Okay, so hearing none, I am going to share this source sheet that I put up on Sefaria. So we could have a whole class about exploring Sefaria. It's spelled SEFARIA.org. And so it takes its name from Sefer, which is the Hebrew word for book. And it is a collection of a vast majority of Jewish wisdom. Most of it is available in translation, everything from the Hebrew Bible to now they actually have the Steinsaltz translation of the Talmud available on their website. You might think that it is problematic that I am still buying the Steinsaltz Talmud. I can show you. This is the reason I took off the thing. This is the current edition that has been published, and so this is just the first volume. It's Berachot, which our first passage is from, and so it has the English side by side with Hebrew. And the words that are directly from the Talmud are in dark letters, bolded letters, and then the explanation is in lighter text. Some teachers don't like this edition because it includes on the sides of the page notes, but also halacha. And so the reason that a Talmud teacher might not like you to read the halacha before you've finished reading the page of Talmud is that the whole point is that they're having a conversation and that they weren't writing a legal code. Legal codes were a thing that started being written in the Middle Ages. They were interested in recording their discussions. And for me, as a post-halachic Jew, this is the most important part of Talmud because if you read Talmud, it can teach you how to debate and live in community, that you don't have to fully agree with people in order to have spiritual community with them, which is truly the most beautiful thing. Not only spiritual community, but political community as well, that we don't have to agree on every topic in order to be one people and to value one another as moral human beings, that all being moral people, we can still come to different religious and political opinions. And that to me is the most important thing that we can take from this tradition specifically. Let me turn off. So up here, there's an A and an Aleph. And you can decide whether you're going to see both the English and the Hebrew or just English. And then you can choose whether your bilingual layout is going to have side by side or one before the other. So let's take this just as the English. So this is in the same format as the book. The other interesting thing before the Koren publication of Steinsaltz, there was an abbreviated Talmud edition that was published by Random House. That was his Rabbi Steinsaltz's original translations, and in this text they put the Hebrew in the middle, and then they wrote the English around it so that you would be reading the English in the same format as a page of Talmud. Because the other thing to know is that there's the reason I said it's the original hyperlinked text. The same way that English is the way that the Talmud is written, with first it will be the Mishnah in the middle, and then it'll be the Gemara, and that's the center text, and then people's commentary is put around it, and then on the sides of it you'll get things like there's an index to halachic codes is on one side of it, and it'll tell you exactly what point in each of the halachic codes this discussion is referenced in. So the Talmud is known for the way that people traditionally differentiate it, is that it's halachic information and agadic information, and basically anything that wasn't about the law was thrown in as Agadah and not studied quite as much, but really is source material for how people actually talk to Jews about understanding how to internalize and make this Judaism part of your life, like what we're going to read now. So, oh, sorry, I did not mean to do that. I was just trying to open the page a little more. Okay, so this is from the Berachot, the page 17a. So A and B is whether it's the front side or the back side of the page, and then verse 4. Would someone else like to read? Sure, Jan, please.
When Mar, son of Ravina, would conclude his prayer, he said the following: My God, guard my tongue from evil and my lips from speaking deceit. To those who curse me, let my soul be silent, and may my soul be like dust to all. Open my heart to your Torah, and may my soul pursue your mitzvot, and save me from a bad mishap, from the evil inclination, from a bad woman, and from all evils that suddenly come upon the world. And all who plan evil against me, swiftly thwart their counsel and frustrate their plans. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart find favor before you, Lord, my rock and my redeemer.
So I'm not sure if people are familiar with this prayer. It is from a section of the Talmud where a bunch of rabbis are recording their personal prayers, but it is actually placed at the end of the Amidah. This one is the one that was chosen for inclusion in most prayer books, including Mishkan Tefillah. So the only edit is that this section, save me from a bad mishap, from the evil inclination, from a bad woman, and from all evils that suddenly come upon the world and all who plan evil against me, was shortened to, as for all who plan evil against me, which is helpful for those of us who question why a bad woman in particular was called out in that list. So does Mar, son of Ravina's prayer resonate with you? And do you have any questions about the text? And in case you want to find the source sheet later, I'm not sure. Now I understand. Yeah. Let me
it doesn't.
Yeah, please, Jackie.
The prayer doesn't resonate with me, because on one hand, it's looking to be unkind, and on the other hand, it's asking God to forgive my retribution. It's, kill those, get rid of those who are against me. I don't see that as a kindness to ask before God. A bad woman. I think that I don't like the term bad. I hate that term. I think that, and he's citing a woman. Again, this is seeing us women as the problem and the evil in the world, and that turns me off right.
You're cutting out a little, but I hear you. Jan?
So what I do like about this prayer, and I do every week in the silent meditation, is guard my tongue from evil and my lips from speaking deceit. And to me, that means gossip also, because that's the hardest thing for me. And I work on it all the time. But, well, we talked about it in our other class about how to make community, you have to talk about each other. Did you know so-and-so is sick, blah, blah. But it's too easy to talk about each other and have it turn into gossip. So I pray for that all the time, because that's something I need strength to do. So.
Amen. Does anyone? Yes, Arlene.
The one sentence that resonates with me is, my God, guard my tongue from evil and my lips from speaking deceit. I don't think God understood New York personalities. It's very, I speak quickly, and sometimes I speak before I think. And luckily my friends know, oh, that's just Arlene, but that's something that I'm also working on, trying to take a deep breath before I actually speak.
Yeah.
So that I'm trying to be a kinder person in my language.
Right. And I imagine it's frustrating that the kindness is not always understood as being the thing that is behind the speech. Anyone else? So part of the reason that this is at the beginning, the first passage that I'm sharing with you, is that without the bad woman part is how it is in prayer books. And it was the only piece of poetry that was left as poetry in translation in the Sidors that I grew up with. So in the conservative movement, in their search for hyper-rationality, they stripped the poetry from their translations of prayers, but this was the one that was left. And since I was a child, it's grabbed at me because it spoke to me in a language that I could understand. Both about my responsibility to guard my tongue, which I too am so quick to speak, and have worked my lifetime around transforming myself into someone who can think before I speak, because I often think that my thoughts are going faster than my tongue, and that by did you want to add something, Jackie? Okay.
No, thank you.
Okay. So yeah, and that the idea of the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara, starts here in the Talmud. And it is it's a powerful way to understand that there is an organized force within us that's actively working towards our own destruction. And that not that I am not responsible for what I do, but that I have the ability to challenge that part of me that is trying to take the easy way out, or pushing everyone away from me because it's scared. That evil inclination and evil in the world are things that I can guard against. So that is how, yeah, Jan.
Okay, we have a children's story that we tell on the high holidays, I think on Yom Kippur, about they decided to get rid of the Yetzer Hara because it was so destructive, and so they locked it up in a teapot. And when it was locked up in the teapot, all production and creation of stuff, like building buildings and earning a living, all that stuff stopped, because the evil inclination is the inclination to get stuff for yourself. And so if you lock that up, nothing gets done. So you have to have it, but you also have to temper it. So yeah, we can't get rid of it, because if we do, then we have nothing.
Right, exactly. Okay. So the other thing to think that that I have thought about a lot is the prayer that Cantor Orly began our Shabbat service with last night, about may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart find favor before you, Hashem, my rock and my redeemer. And really what it means to allow Hashem to be my rock, and what that visualization helps to accomplish, if you can connect with it. Okay, so moving on. So in Bava Metzia, there is this famous conversation about an oven of Achnai. And Achnai is a snake. So would someone like to read this text for us?
I'll read it.
Excellent.
Carol.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah. And this is known as the oven of Achnai. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of Achnai, a snake, in this context? Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, that's good. It is characterized in that manner due to the fact that the rabbis surrounded it with their statements like, this snake, which often forms a coil when it rests, and deemed it impure. The sages thought on that day, when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his explanation from him. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halakha, is that right? Halakha is in, yeah, that one is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits. What's a cubit? The rabbi said to him, one does not cite halakhayak proof from the carob tree. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it. The water in the stream turned backwards and began flowing the opposite direction. They said to him, one does not cite halakhic proof from the stream. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. The walls of the study hall leaned inward and began to fall. Rabbi Yeshua, where we go? Scolded the walls and said to them, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in the matter of halakha, What is the nature of your involvement in this dispute? The Gemara relates, the walls did not fall because of the deference due Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten because of the deference due.
Sorry.
Due Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain leaning. Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will approve it. The divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the halakha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion? Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, it is not in heaven. The Gemara asks, what is the relevance of the phrase, it is not in heaven in this context? Rabbi Yamiria said, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice as you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline. Since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the halakha is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. The Gemara relates, years after Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah, the prophet, and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at the time when Rabbi Yehoshua issued his declaration? Elijah said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have, whoops, that's okay. Oh, triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. That was a lot to go through. And I know part of the carob tree because Rabbi Lochman for years has always given that story on the high holidays. And that's a wonderful story. But the rest of it is just like, woo, kind of a lot of stuff thrown in all together, like in a washing machine, we're going to go around. Is there like a big point to all this being together? I mean, obviously, why?
Male competition.
What competition?
Male competition.
We're supposed to argue.
The arguing, you know, the competitiveness of our sages and males in general to have this kind of discussion. You know, women didn't write then, or even have a voice. But not saying that women may not be any different in the same position, but male rhetoric, I think. It loses me in the process, Reb, to go through all this kind of crap. Feels like, oh, I'm listening to another man spout out some rhetoric here. And I would just like to go through and get to the end, which is my children have triumphed over me. You know, that's the conclusion. Well, here on earth is not heaven. And you make a distinction. We have one life as Jews. And this is our life, and we have free will from God as long as we're doing justice and kindness and following the basic rules. Anyway.
Yeah.
It's a lot like Moses trying to prove to the Pharaoh, oh, look, if God's doing it, then my staff will crawl away. If God's doing it this, oh, well, that's not proof. Well, that's not proof. It's like the same story.
Right. I mean, it is pretty fantastical too, right? Like the whole idea that all of the physical reality would change its way of being to honor the intellectual truth of one particular rabbi is, you know, not obviously not in accordance with how we would make a point as modern humans. So that's part of it.
But then they go, well, you know, Earth isn't going to prove it. Rivers aren't going to prove it. Da 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 da. Okay, how about heaven? No, we don't listen to heaven anymore either. So yeah, you lose.
Yes, Jackie.
From a psychoanalytic construct, the snake is representative of the penis, the law, the male. And I don't know how we started off with the snake and ended up over here. I mean, I got lost of that progression. We started off talking about the definition of snake. So how does that, it's just an animal that wraps itself around you. That's what they call it.
Well, the oven that they're talking about is coiled like a snake. And they're talking about whether or not it's pure. I agree that I mean, we could go into the details.
Right. To me, the snake is a pistol. It's not a cord. The snake represents a pistol, not a cord. I mean, it's obviously thinking in the time is what they're thinking, but it doesn't bring that image to my mind.
Well,
A
they
snake
were
that
looking,
coils around, ready to spring.
no, they were looking at this. They were trying to determine if the oven was halakhic because it was shaped and coiled like a snake, which was not halakhic. So then they take down this whole, you know, I think it's a beautiful kind of a very typical Jewish story. You know, they want you to, it's almost like poetry, you know, it goes almost like a song, you know, those songs about, you know, like 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4. And finally at the end, it's like pretty much all for nothing, you know, it in a way, it's like it didn't matter because everybody's going to wind up dead and gone. And it didn't really matter that this oven was shaped like a snake. I don't know.
Right.
I think it was, and I think the whole process of this storytelling and comparisons and poetry, it is our DNA. It's our Jewish DNA. It ended, you know, or it continued all throughout our history, even to the stories in the Catskills that the comedians would tell. You know, by the end, it was like everybody's just throwing up their hands and going, well, it didn't matter at the end. I don't know. I think these things are really interesting to think that people wrote this thousands of years ago, and we're still talking about it today. And we have to see it through the eyes of what they were trying to deal with. What other tradition does that? I don't know, you know, and that we would have such respect for these people that we see as like a waste of time, but it wasn't a waste of time. It taught us things. So I don't know. It's interesting. My question I have a question about, so they would take, in terms of the Talmudic study, they would take like a prayer and they would kind of evaluate it. I don't understand when you say the brachot, and did they go through all of the brachas and talk about them? Is that what this process was?
No. So at the time of the Talmud, there were 2 prayers that were mandated to be said. They were the only set prayers. I mean, other prayers were coming into being at the time, but the set prayers that were talked about were the Shema and Tefillah. And when they talked about Tefillah, they were referring to the Amidah. So those were the only. So they would talk about when the time for saying the prayers were, when can you start saying the morning blessing, when is it over that you can say the morning one, when do you say the middle of the day one, when do you say the evening one, why do we say prayers at these times? And then in the course of it, they recorded their own prayers. So it's, for me, it was personally an easier entry into the Talmud because it was something I was more familiar with from my prayer book. And it was sort of like a seeing the source, because a lot of our prayers are actually quotes from the Bible put together into their own prayers. And so the Ashrei is the prayer that's said in the morning service, and it is mostly one psalm, but it begins with a different psalm so that it connects better in with the the cycle of the morning service. So in terms of the oven of Achnai, it's an interesting thing, because if you learn this text from an Orthodox rabbi, the ultimate point is how powerful the majority opinion of rabbis is, and how importantly connected directly to the divine that majority is. And that when you're dealing with matters of law, you have to respect the majority opinion, and you have to go by the majority opinion. But they also always cited the minority opinion, even though they didn't follow through on that, because they assumed that it was possible in future generations that the minority opinion might become the accepted opinion. And they didn't want you to not know that we also grappled with these questions. So that is how an Orthodox perspective goes on this. Now, the Reform perspective says, aha, lo bashamayim hi, it is not in heaven. And all of this halachic stuff you have made up. You have not even listened to the divine voice when they were calling to you. You were going back to the traditions of the rabbis before you. We as modern Jews have a different perspective on how to connect this breadth of tradition into our lives. And therefore, maybe the halacha of the Talmud is not the source, the foundational source of how we stay rooted and continue on Judaism. So you can see how with the same source material, you can get to polar opposite positions on how to actually live life. Yes, please, Arlene.
So here's my question. This is all very interesting, but I want to know, what is it relative to me in my life today? What is it? How is the Talmud relevant to the world in 2022? I mean, it's fascinating to go and talk about it, and a snake oven and all that. What does it mean, and what's the interpretation? But since we take this as such an important document, I want to know what the relevance is and how it helps guide me in my life today.
So I think that different Jews will answer that differently. I find much more source material in the Agadic tradition, in the tales of how to live a good life, and how to which aspects of your personality make you a good person. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff, both in the ethics of the fathers, the Pirkei Avot, but also sprinkled throughout the Talmud. And then the way that people communicated their understanding of how the Bible was relevant in their time, and how they understood the Bible can help it become, can be another source of inspiration for how we can make all of these sources important to ourselves. But it absolutely is like any other text from 1,000+ years ago. It requires interpretation and wrestling in order. It's not going to be as easy. It's not going to be as easy a fit for 2022 as a book written in the last 10 years.
I'm just trying to find, we consider this so important and so holy. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just trying, as a modern Jew, how this relates to me. And I find sometimes reading these old fables, interesting, but not, again, relevant. That's just me. I find it interesting, but I don't find it relevant. And I know a lot of people live their lives exactly, with the Torah and the Talmud. And I question that. I question how it's not, why we are living our life from so many years ago, and why it has not been updated by modern rabbis. I mean, I don't know if these are silly questions. I don't know if these are naive, whatever, but I'm just, trying to understand it.
Arlene, it's Carol.
Yeah.
I'm listening to you, and from my side of it, if we had not been opened up today to the Zoom and heard this, it relatively would not speak to you because you wouldn't be seeking it per se. Not to say that that's a bad thing. And I understand where you would like to see where it fits into your life now, but not everything is contemporary. And you're right, other people will look towards it to run or help them to decide how they're going to be Jewish or whatnot, and look in a different aspect than we would. And Joe said, I believe he murmured something, that some of it has been updated. We just don't know because we're not studying it right now. We're not there. We don't have that available in front of us, but things are always evolving, as in the women's commentary, and which has to do with the Torah, which are different. So I think that what's speaking to us now is what's coming out of Reform synagogues and whatnot, that we need to look at what they are putting out there as far as studying and this and that, but we just haven't been exposed to a lot of this. And I think that once you are, and you look to see what those answers are, they're probably there, but it's a tough, I think there are people saying the same thing you are. So I think that there are things that are being said, we just don't know or answered where the answers are right now.
No, that's a good point. Thank you. I would like to see and be exposed to the updated commentaries.
Right. And we don't know exactly where that is. I mean, if we could clone Reb Minster, explain Zoom 101, there's all sorts of things. So I think what's going on with this is given a big topic about how there are things there that are the basis for eons that this has been going on, and how, yes, we are finally interpreting it. And, the women, just to know that the women at the time were the keepers of the, let's say, the families, the recipes, the home life, the way that you lived, and kept your home together, and how you helped the men be able to worship, because that's the way it was set up. And some of that's still going on today, but in other ways we've expanded it. So there's a lot of real cool stuff in there. You got to take the old with the new. So
yeah, I mean,
that's my spiel.
No, Carol, that's wonderful. I mean, I still go back to some of the things from 10, 20 years when I first joined Talmud and David. I happen to fast. A lot of people don't fast on Yom Kippur, but I like that Rabbi said it's less important to fast than it is to provide food for the needy. And that spoke to me as a Jew. That speaks to me, like Shari always said, the beauty of all of the food packages in the lobby was what made it relevant for her. This is what, as Jews, we are doing. Look at all that was supporting, Foothill Unity, and countless other temples supporting countless others, food banks. And that to me is what I want to delve into, you know, that as a Jew, how do I make it a better world? How does my religion help me become a better person? And I guess I want more modern, like last night watching the news, there was a gentleman in Ukraine who said, I thought we were finished with Hitler and now we have Putin. Why didn't God allow a Putin? And he was a man like in his 90s. So he had survived the Holocaust.
Yeah, well,
And-
there's a lot of that going on now. And I think that the word is that we can put out and work on is that this is what Temple Beth David is. And I don't want to deviate too much from Reb Minster's wonderful Talmud discussion. But this is what to keep in mind for Temple Beth David going ahead. We are going to keep the food banks. We're going to do modern things to serve the community, and we're going to continue being Jewish. That's it. There you go.
All right. Yeah, no, I like that. And like I said, these are just my questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait,
Yeah.
Reb Minster, could you put that thing back up there so we could read it again? I'd like to see it.
Yeah.
I'd like to see the whole.
So I also just want to say that part of why we're not looking at secondary sources. I didn't translate. Translate is an important word. I didn't translate from my book, the Cambridge Companion to the Talmud and Rabbinic Literature, because for me, when you ask like why the Talmud, this book is the reason why the Talmud, because this book is a series of a compilation of dense academic essays, but they are essays about how our people lived and what they believed about the people that they lived with based on Talmudic sources. So for example, there is an article about the acknowledgement that the rabbis had of 6 distinct gender identities. And that, it was something that was normal at the time to recognize androgynous people and other distinctions of people, but that the rabbis were grappling with how to understand these different gender identities within their binary world of male and female. And they were making legal decisions based on the fact that what was required in terms of circumcision and doing halachic things was based on whether you were male or female. So again, not the worldview that we share today, but it's an important light of understanding how people lived at the time. And it is quite difficult for all of us as modern people to set our own ethics aside and our own vision of equality aside to think into the worldviews of the people that wrote the Talmud. But it does actually help understand the sources for our ethics, for our spiritual seeking, and for how we build a community together. I also wanted to give you the straight text because last time there was a request that we look that when we were talking about the Bible, there was a conversation about how we don't need to look at commentaries. We want to be able to read the Bible and make our own decisions about it. So I felt like reading the Talmud and making our own decisions about it was a good exercise, whether or not it ever is relevant to, how you're moving forward as a Jewish community. It's of the 6 sections of this class, this was definitely not the one that I ever expected anyone to want more classes on within this community. But I do think that knowing that it wasn't just a straight progression from Mount Sinai to the rabbis in the way that an Orthodox understanding of how Judaism came to be, recognizing that there was a struggle during the early rabbinic period is an important part of understanding that we are also at a transition point in Judaism.
Reb Minster, isn't it true that when one goes into like a Talmud study, they do it in pairs and they
Yes.
do it over a long period of time? You work with a partner to go over things?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
So
called
that's-
chavruta.
Mhm. And that's an interesting tradition that still goes on.
Yes. It's a very powerful one. In that your chavruta is not necessarily your friend. It's a person that you're studying with and who helps encourage your intellectual curiosity and sharpen your understanding of the grammar and the ways that arguments are being formed on the page, and understanding where different people come from. So every sentence can be untangled, and then also looking at the commentary sources, because there are a lot. Particularly understanding what Rashi says about this, and then what the people that came after Rashi said about it. All of those conversations are also on the page, in terms of making it more relevant over time to more Jews. So Yehoshua is the Hebrew for Joshua, and we don't have an English form of Rabbi Eliezer's name, but that I apologize that the Yehoshua is such a can be a tongue twister. So to me, when you ask about what's the most relevant thing to us, it's the second question. When is it more important to be accurate, and when is it more important to make decisions that are best for the community? The story itself seemed to say that that the divine voice was in favor of Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, but Rabbi Joshua was in support of the majority. So there's something to be said about, even if one person has a more correct way of moving forward, you can't get there on your own, and that moving as a community through a consensus, a majority. I mean, they didn't wait for consensus. They only waited for majority. So a consensus is when you get everyone to agree that you are moving forward in one way. A majority is that the majority agree, you still have people that disagree, but you're still moving with the majority. And that to continue on as a community, you have to have majority support, or else the community is going to falter. I did include one more text, so this is, I apologize that this isn't the most interesting part of the ethics of the fathers, Pirkei Avot, but it is the chain of transmission. Would someone like to? It's the beginning of the chain of transmission. Would someone like to read this for us? It's a shorter piece. Sure, Arlene.
Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said three things: be patient, quote unquote, in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah.
Thank you. So it's known as the chain of transmission, and it's a fundamental statement on how the rabbis envisioned their direct connection to Moses. It's also a justification for the expansion of Jewish law, to account for the lack of a temple in which to sacrifice, and to create ideals for living within an ever-changing society. So halakha is usually translated as law. It is a legal code, but it is more than that, because it is about how to live together on this way. So my questions for this is, does this resonate with you? And how would you describe the chain of transmission of Jewish knowledge? And then what role does authority play in your Jewish life?
What do they mean about a fence around the Torah?
I was going to comment on that.
Is it
That does resonate to me. A fence around the Torah means that we keep our exclusivity, that we continue with the Old Testament and its teachings as our rock, as our protector, as our surrounding our boundaries. And we never lose sight of the fact we're Jews, and this is our Torah, and we don't allow the diaspora, moving around to change the laws. That, for me, is what it means.
To me, it's almost like to make a protection, to protect it. And maybe that's why we put it in the ark, to protect it. We close it off. We don't have it out on a table. So we're protecting it by putting a fence around it. But that's a very interesting word. I wonder what the word was in Hebrew. Why they translated it as a fence.
I want to say, so
Yeah.
if we say this is our Torah, we're keeping it, we're protecting it, we're putting a fence around it, it's not going to change, then we need Talmud and all that stuff, because the world changes and goes forward. And so needs are going to change as the world changes. So we have to have that history along with the base document. We have to see how it's been used and interpreted and passed down. Otherwise, the base document would eventually be so foreign that we could never use it. So
Right.
it's kind of like the United States Constitution being a living document.
But it was only living, it's, as far as, not talking about the United States, but it stopped after the men of the greatest. There was no more great assembly. I mean, you have the halakha, it doesn't change. There may be some different interpretations.
It's like the Ashkenazic Jews on Passover weren't allowed to eat peanuts. And so I think it's only like 2-3 years ago that the Sephardic Jews and the Ashkenazic Jews got together and said, okay, now you can all eat peanuts because we're all one. As long as we're like isolated, doesn't matter what that half of our family's doing, but we're not isolated anymore. So, as the world changes, we have to interpret it for our use in new ways, but try to be as, as true to the actual Torah as we can. But there's things we can't do today that we did then.
Yeah, like stone people to death.
Well, even the Talmud thinks that didn't happen.
We're supposed to stone them to make them go outside the gate to isolate them.
I'm sure it did. I mean, we were not so wonderful that we Disneyfy everything. I mean, all of these things, we had sacrifices and we had stoning and we had horrible things. I mean, it's just what it was. And
Yeah.
It was in the context, they didn't live apart from the rest of the cultures that they inhabited.
Well,
So
they did live apart.
they were,
Yeah.
I mean, these have to be seen as historical documents. It's like looking at hieroglyphics in Egypt and going, well, how is this relevant to me? Well, it's probably not, but it's fascinating to see what it was like.
And you need to know where you came from.
Yeah, I just think it's fascinating to see what they were dealing with. And it's like peanuts. I mean, they didn't even have peanuts in that time. Although maybe they did because they originated in Africa. So who knows what they had? But
They must have had legumes of some sort.
didn't have quinoa. And so you
Yeah,
always
yeah.
have to update the information based on these interpretations of what was a grain and what was a seed and what was a grass. I mean, that to me is fascinating.
Right. So that was about the fact that the way that they carried their stuff, that the bags of goods, dried goods, could be mixed together, and they were worried about that mixture. They did have a differentiation, but they just felt like back in the Middle Ages that it was that you couldn't be sure that you weren't going to get grain in with your rice, and that was why they made that decision. I do also want to clarify that this is just the beginning of Ethics of Our Fathers, and their chain of transmission didn't stop with the men of the Great Assembly. They went on to list all the head, like Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai were houses of study that go back to the Second Temple period. So they trace down from Hillel and Shammai to other rabbis and other rabbis, and the way that rabbinic Judaism understands this transmission is that by studying the Talmud and by studying other sources of rabbinic understanding of Judaism, you become part of that chain of transmission. And that is why people place hands on you in order to ordain you. And it's part of the way that rabbis justified that they are the correct leaders for the Jewish people. So,
All right,
Arlene,
can we go back to the words? You have the English and the Hebrew right on the screen. Make
Right.
a fence around the Torah. What
Yeah.
do the Hebrew words say?
yeah, it says va'asu, which is make,
Yeah.
siyag, which is fence, la Torah, to the Torah.
Okay, so they don't say anything else but that. Okay.
That
And
that
that's-
phrase is right there. And in terms of the fence that they were talking about, that is a metaphor for the ways in which the halakha is expanded from the short instructions of the Bible. So the most famous example is that in the Bible, you are not allowed to cook a calf in its mother's milk. And from there, the rabbis created the distinction between eating meals with meat and meals with milk, and that you couldn't, that fence is a more complete separation between the two. That is the type of fence that they're talking about, that we want to be even more conscientious than what is required of us from the Torah.
I don't like that interpretation. I can't make that leap with them. I think it's really, I can't make that leap with them. I think that I don't agree with that. So I have a right to dissent, right?
Sure.
And
Of course.
that's what the Talmud teaches us. If I don't agree with their opinion, I don't like their metaphor. I want my own metaphor.
But that's what the halakha does, and obviously you don't have to follow the halakha, but
Right,
but
right. It allows you to have your own metaphor,
well,
if that means.
yeah, not if you're Orthodox.
Within the context of historical perspective, of course.
So that's what Reformed Judaism
that's
is. You
not-
have to learn it all and then decide for yourself. So we're not all supposed to have the same answer as Reformed Jews.
Right.
Reb Minster, I have another question. Was the Beit Hillel and the Beit Shammai, did they have like different philosophies? I mean, was one more liberal, one more conservative? I mean, what was the
Yes.
distinction between them?
So Hillel was more liberal and Shammai was more strict. And the Talmud usually goes with the decisions of Hillel, but always records Shammai. It's the subject of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's extensive discussion of the Talmud, which is called in English Heavenly Torah as Refracted Through the Generations. And he sets out in philosophic prose understanding both of their perspectives in a more in a way that is more complementary to both. So whereas the Talmud itself is just strictly telling you one person's opinion and then the other person's opinion, and if you understand how the Talmud is written, you'll know that this one is the one that we follow, but we're just telling you about this other opinion. This will give you a deeper respect for the place from which both of those houses are coming from. And it is, it is really about whether you are making space for, if you are holding strong to tradition and wanting to continue it as you've understand it to be, whether or not you keep other Jews with you versus whether you are in a more expansive state of mind.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I wonder why there isn't the third school, the angel school, the connection with all the different angels and dreams and that, and why this is not a part of all these writings when in fact they just zip right over those. I mean, why didn't they have someone doing the same kind of things, and why wasn't that line of thinking included within this?
It totally was. Yes, absolutely. So there are the angels line of thinking absolutely recorded. So the history of Jewish mysticism goes back to this time as well. We have snippets of recordings of what they understood. Now, the thing about talking about angels is that the most important thing that they wanted you to know is that you probably aren't qualified to know anything about it.
Right.
They were.
That's what I want to know about. When I'm not,
I am so excited that you want to know about it because people often tell me that that is not something of interest, but it is.
I don't know if other people are interested, though.
Yeah, absolutely. It is my passion. So yes. So briefly, they had an entire understanding. They had a very complicated understanding of the angel world during this period. They had a hierarchy. They were really into hierarchy. So they had a hierarchy of angels, and they all did different things for on behalf of God and intercessing with human life. And you could go and request help from an angel. There was also the way that they understood using Merkava mysticism. Merkava is a chariot. So they understood this idea of meditating into and visualizing a chariot taking you on a journey into the heavens. And from there, you would have, you might hear a bat kol, a heavenly voice. You might see a glimpse of the throne of Hashem. So there's lots and lots there. From that, you get the strands that go on to become Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism that began in the Middle Ages and really took over as the primary source of Jewish mysticism. And the Kabbalah's source text, beginning text, is the Zohar, not quite as long as the Talmud. The Zohar is written in a way as a commentary on the Bible. And then you have different schools of thought in Kabbalah, the strongest of which is Lurianic Kabbalah. So Rabbi Isaac Luria created a myth about how the world came into being before the words of Bereshit that most Kabbalists after him agreed to. And then you get into Hasidism and other forms of Jewish connection to reaching towards the divine. Yes.
And the reason you don't teach this progression to the children is that we don't allow the average person into this realm.
So that's a bit of a it's a bit of a myth.
No, it's not a myth. It's using trance to move someone into a spiritual place, as you describe it. I don't think it's a myth. I think it's a technique of allowing someone into a spiritual space that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get into because you're doing a light trance on them. What do you think, Joanne?
I just meant that it's a myth that people aren't that there's a certain age before which you're not allowed to study this stuff.
Children aren't taught this. Children aren't taught to sit down and take the chariot and take the ride and do a connection. You know, Catholic children are taught it in their own way. Jewish children aren't taught it. I was never taught this. I mean, I'm hearing it for the first time. You know,
what I meant, so when I interviewed for this placement and I was asked what my thesis was about, I was told that the community was not interested in.
Correct. I think they're probably not. I'm particularly interested, but I don't know that other people are. I mean, you may be boring people. You're not boring me, but you may be boring people.
So, so just to get to connect it back to the Talmud, there is a famous story in the Talmud, the four who entered Pardes, and Pardes is the orchard, is what the word actually means. It's a word for paradise. The story itself has come to be understood as a reason for people to not go the mystical path. But the way that a literary understanding of the Talmud sees it is that whenever you get a story about four people, and this the story of the four children also comes from the Talmudic period, that whenever you get a story of four people, it is not telling you literally about four people. It is giving you two extremes and two middle points, and that your response to any given situation might be anywhere on this continuum. So it is not, so just as the Haggadah is not trying to tell you to just ignore one of your children, so too is the story of entering Pardes not trying to tell you to never attempt to connect to the divine. So in the story, one person dies, one person goes crazy, one person leaves the path of Judaism, and Rabbi Akiva is the only one to enter and leave fully intact.
That is totally against my tarot understanding, and I can't buy into that just in terms of the visual and the meaning of four. So I understand what you're saying, but I don't divide like that. If that's a Jewish divide, that's a Jewish divide, but I don't divide like that. Interesting.
Okay, well, it was a literary choice made by authors of the time period. It's not necessarily how all Jews
Interesting. I'll keep it in mind. Interesting.
So, I mean, it's just to me, as Arlene said, it is about the reason to study any part of Judaism is how does it make my life better? And so what I have been studying in my thesis is how our ethical tradition and our mystical tradition have grown side by side, and that having an understanding that what you do ultimately matters makes trying to be better more important. And that you can see those sources going back to the Talmud up through the Middle Ages to the modern era. And for me, the way that I understand the growth of Judaism is a three-legged stool, that it is both the halakha and the ethical sources of how to live a good life and live in community well, and how to reach towards God. So I understand that the Talmud itself, maybe not the most interesting part of our tradition for many people. So I did just want to let you know, the reason I brought all these books was to let you know about these sources, that the translation of Abraham Joshua Heschel is available, which puts it into more poetic language. The Rambam wrote an introduction to the Mishnah. The Mishnah Torah is how the Rambam consolidated the Talmud into a halachic code that he wrote. Rabbi Aidan Steinschaltz wrote this small volume of Talmudic images, which is stories about the rabbis that are in the Talmud. The most comprehensive book available on the rabbis of the Talmud is called Masters of the Talmud, Their Lives and Views, by Alfred Kolach. So this is if you are reading a page of the Talmud, you could look them up in here and figure out if they were, sometimes it'll record like someone of the son's generation talking to the father's generation, and sometimes they're talking across larger distances than that. And then I posted the introduction from this book, The Essential Talmud, which is by Steinschaltz. So this is an easier read of an introduction to the book, but it is, he was an Orthodox rabbi, so it is from deep within the tradition. That's the other reason that I like academic sources, because they're not, sorry for the big word, filiopietistic. They aren't explaining from within such a deep love of what they're talking about that they can't see, they're not seeing it objectively.
How about an easy read on the mystical Torah? I mean, I don't see you have one of the things, nothing on that. I think that I don't want to personally, I mean, I don't know how other people think, but I've seen a lot of the traditional stuff, and no matter what you're presenting, if there's something a little offbeat, I'm always interested in hearing something offbeat. And I think mysticism is offbeat. I don't know how you feel about that, Arlene.
No, I would like to see, unfortunately, I have to leave now. I wanted to thank Reb Minster, and I'm really excited by everybody's comments and thoughts, and for you guys putting up with my questions. But what I would love, just a thought is, I would love a thing is, how is the Talmud Torah relevant to me? I mean, I would love just to have that, and I would totally investigate the mysticism. I'm with you, Jackie. I like that also, but I would, it might be something interesting for the kids. I don't know, but sometimes how do we make the old ways interesting? I mean, there's so many ways to mesh it. So but thank you. This was very stimulating, and I appreciate it.
Pleasure. So I will take that as my my call for next week, because next week the topic is medieval philosophy, and I will focus on mysticism. I do have to warn you that that the source texts continue with the same line as all of our other source texts and are very male centric, some of them very anti-female. However,
wonderful.
However, there are plenty.
It is better to know the enemy in order to move them aside than not know what the enemy has said.
Maybe
So
that's
I think all this male rhetoric
That's why Abraham Lincoln is my famous president, is my favorite president. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Amazing. Yes. So just as a preview of our final 3 sessions. So our next session is next week, and it will be on mysticism from the Middle Ages into the early modern era, because that is my sweet spot, what I am doing my thesis on. And then the 5th session will be on modern Judaism, about emancipation and how that led to the beginning of Reformed Judaism and the other denominations. And then the 6th session is envisioned as the question that keeps coming up: what does this all mean to us, and how do we integrate it forward? And I will definitely bring a lot more modern sources to that 6th session.
I think that's what you should call the last session. What does this all mean to us? Yep.
Good.
Excellent, Reb Minster. What an
Thank
insightful
you.
morning. You really are
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
having this
Thank you.
question. Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom,
Very-
everyone.
very-
Shabbat
Shalom.
Very stimulating.
See
Thank
you
you.
next week.
Very, very, very.
Thank you.
Very nice. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.